Hello, everyone, and welcome to Social with the Side of Justice, a multi episode series where we talk about various topics centered around the importance of social justice.
The main theme of our podcast this year is the lack of diverse representation in literature, film, education, and government.
Our goal here at Social with the Side of Justice is to bring awareness to this issue. And also, we want to highlight those individuals who are fighting to bring more representation into their respective fields.
Today's episode will be hosted by me, Sammy.
Me, Galo Slater Sanchez Fajardo.
And me, Jen. On today's episode, we'll be joined by comic book author Edgardo Miranda-Rodriguez.
Mr. Miranda-Rodriguez is most known for his comic book series La Borinqueña.
You may ask yourself, what is La Borinqueña and what is it about? Well, La Borinqueña is a story about Marisol Rios de la Luz, an undergraduate student studying environmental science at Columbia University. During a trip to Puerto Rico, she received her superpowers from a Taino goddess and her sons.
As much as this story contains action and heroes, this story also goes in depth on how Marisol discovers who she is as an Afro-Puerto Rican. Throughout the story, she creates a deeper connection with her culture as well as realizing how much love she has for her country.
Yo, we're so excited for you to hear us
Yeah.
today.
Yeah, we are.
La Borinqueña, I love it, bro.
Gracias.
We hope you enjoy the show.
Social with the Side of Justice is sponsored by Long Branch Public Schools Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
So, good morning, Mr. Miranda-Rodriguez. How you feeling today?
I feel good. Me siento bien.
¿Te sientes bien?
This
Me
is
gusta.
an incredible opportunity to be here with you guys this morning and to have this conversation. By the way, I love the name of your podcast.
Yeah.
Social with the Side of Justice. Yes.
Eso me encanta.
That was cool,
Eso
right?
me encanta. And I mean, everything needs a side of justice. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. It's great to be able to write these books and publish them, but it's another thing to actually have an engaged discourse with students such as yourselves who are actually reading and have questions. So, vamos, let's get it right
Let's
into
get
it.
it, bro. All right. So, where did you grow up, and can you describe your family and upbringing?
Bueno, I was actually born here in New Jersey. My upbringing, the best word to describe it would be nomadic. By the time I was 18, I lived in 22 different places. I came from a very
Wow.
poor,
That's
I came from a very poor family. We were raised on public assistance. I collected bottles and cans, collecting a nickel for each one. And I have to also note that in 2023, you still get a nickel for like a can when you turn it in. And in the 80s, you were getting a nickel back then. So I think there's a little bit of a discrepancy there. And I grew up throughout New York City, Puerto Rico, Pennsylvania, Central New York, and Syracuse, New York. And I went to college at Colgate University, which is also in Central New York. And that shaped a lot of my identity because I lived in quite a few marginalized communities, neighborhoods that were disenfranchised, neighborhoods that were lacking infrastructure, lacking programs, lacking support, neighborhoods that were predominantly Puerto Rican. And I lived throughout the diaspora. This is what we refer to as kind of like living beyond your original country. So, for example, Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States now for 125 years. There are 3 million on the archipelago, but there are about 6 million across the United States. And they're living, the majority are in New York City, followed by New Jersey, followed by Philadelphia, Chicago, Connecticut, and on. But my childhood was shaped by living in so many different places and seeing the disparities of literally growing up as a person of color here in the United States.
Impresionante.
Speaking about being a person of color, were you ever stereotyped or discriminated against for being Puerto Rican?
I think the main prejudice that I faced was the language, right? I grew up with English as a first language. So when people would read my name, they would automatically assume that I was Spanish dominant and I didn't understand Spanish. I recall one time even as an undergraduate student, I was already at Colgate University with a full academic tuition scholarship. And I was actually placed in a remedial writing class. And I'm sitting in this class going, why am I in this class? and they kind of look perplexed, and they're like, well, you kind of aren't proficient. And I'm like, I was an honor roll student. I was like a salutatorian in my. I was like, I don't understand. How am I in this remedial writing class? And I had
Right.
to take the class. So I'm sitting in the class and oftentimes was correcting the professor um, during
As you
during the
should, though.
class. So that was kind of a lot of the of what I faced. There were occasional racial discriminations that I faced, police brutality that I faced growing up as a Puerto Riqueño in New York City. But I have to also acknowledge that as a Puerto Riqueño of a lighter complexion, there's a certain privilege that comes with that, in the sense that since I'm not tan, since I'm not visibly of African descent, I don't face the same level of discrimination that my darker complexion sisters and brothers would face. But that doesn't make me blind to the injustices that exist as well.
That was a lot, man.
Yeah.
That was impactful.
We noticed in our research that when you were in college, you were a student activist. Would you say that was like the start of your like activist career?
It actually started in high school.
Mhm.
When I was in high school, I became very well aware of apartheid in South Africa. At the time, there was a government system that legitimately placed people of color in a different class and in a different part of the country. And white Europeans were actually those in power. These were actually the colonizers. Um, the most famous South African that exists right now is Charlize Theron, right? The actor. And there was actually a TV show called Dila Semero, and they interviewed her and they asked her, "So you're from South Africa, right?" And she was like, "Yeah." And they asked her, "So are you like African American then?" Because a lot of South
Mhm.
Africans, they acknowledged and thought identified themselves as Africans, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that sparked a consciousness in my childhood as a teenage student in high school, like you guys are right now. But I was also living in an era where art was being used transformatively to raise awareness. There were musicians that were using their platform to create songs to raise money for humanitarian aid in Ethiopia. There were songs that were being created in protest of apartheid in South Africa. So that carried into my experience as an undergraduate student at Colgate University. And then inevitably, I became a leader in the Latinx community on campus. I was president of the Latin American Student Organization. I mobilized students for cultural events, programs that helped reconnect us to our identity that were kind of supplemental to what we were already getting in class. And when necessary, I spoke out against any injustices that were visible. And at the time, we were very well concerned with the underrepresentation in the physical classroom, in the curriculum, in the course load. Interestingly enough, so many years later, when I went to visit Colgate University to actually give a talk on La Borinqueña, it's a completely different school now. One of the core curricular courses at Colgate University is Puerto Rican Studies, which is incredible. One of the books being taught at Colgate University is La Borinqueña. There were actually 4 different classes that are teaching La Borinqueña: gender studies, um, comic book graphic novel production, Puerto Rican studies, and LGBTQ studies. So it was an incredible como se dice, change and turn of events. So that was kind of like the, como se dice, the extension of my activism. And that's been a part of my reality in my life for for all of my adulthood, actually, because from like 16, 17, when I was a high school student through college, it just kind of like, woke me up. I used to say when I was younger, oftentimes the word is kind of like a trigger word in this generation, the concept of wokeness. But when we were younger, we would refer to ourselves as conscious. We've kind of awakened. We've accepted this new way of looking at the world, and now that we're awake, there's no way we can go back to sleep. It's just insomnia from now on. Once you become a witness to the reality of living in the world.
Nice.
So, when would you say your love for comic books started?
Chico, eso empezó desde niño.
Right?
Since I was a
Yeah,
child, I
okay.
was into comic books. My older cousin, may he rest in peace, Santiago de Jesus, introduced me to comic books. The first trade paperbacks or graphic novels that were produced by Marvel at the time, Son of Origins. These books were anthologies of reprinted stories that were originally published in the 60s. He was always drawing comics for me. So as a child in elementary school, I took a liking to drawing. I was creating my own characters, creating my own stories. Many of my classmates saw me drawing and they would pay me 50 cents, 75 cents to make comic books for them. And I would go home that night, write a story, write the comic, draw the comic book, staple the pages together, bring it to school the next day, make some money, take that money, go to the store to actually buy actual comics. So I've been connected to comic book storytelling since I was a child, before it was this multi-billion-dollar film franchise that we see now, that is kind of like multi-genre, multi-medium, finding itself in everything from video games to fruit roll-ups to underwear. I mean, you could walk up and down Target and find a superhero on everything
Yeah, you can.
at this point.
Yeah, I can
And
find
when I was reading and collecting comic books, it wasn't the case. It was actually seen as something that was out there. It was actually seen as something that was kind of countercultural, believe it or not. You know, you were seen as an outsider. You were ostracized for being a nerd, because that's exactly what I was. I was a nerd. I loved reading, and I loved reading comic books.
Okay. And you were doing the business like when you were a kid, right? Like
I guess I
selling the
was. I
book.
didn't think
You were
querer
doing money.
queriendo.
You
I
were
was
making
already
money,
doing like my
I see
marketing,
you,
my
I see you.
entrepreneurism. Yeah, it was always there. It was always there.
That's awesome because you were so passionate about it. Like you speak so passionate about it.
Yeah, it's just something that I really love the concept of superhero stories, because it's something that likens itself to ancient mythologies, but it's in a contemporary fashion. And for easily the last century, well, 2 centuries, because we just closed out a century 23 years ago. I'm from
Yeah.
the last century, guys. um, Comic book storytelling, particularly in the superhero genre, is something that's so prevalent in American culture. For your generation, you've been bombarded with superhero imagery because of the film franchises that exist. But it's such a part of Americana culture that graphic novels are taught in public schools. Graphic novels are taught at universities. There are graduate students right now studying and writing papers about using graphic novels so that they can teach these graphic novels to other students, like my books. There actually recently was uh, s- um, a symposium held in England where a professor was actually working on a paper and presenting it to an academic audience that included a conversation and an argument about La Borinqueña and how my graphic novel can address colonialism. When I write these books, I write them as a tool to raise money and to raise awareness, but I don't deliberately come up with like, como se dice, like a blueprint and say, this is going to be so that this can be used by this school and this school can pull this from that. It finds itself in the hands of scholars. It finds itself in the hands of readers that are multifaceted. And that's what's fantastic about storytelling and publishing books, that this book can find itself in the hand of someone who can be uh, a graphic designer, an illustrator, a doctor, a psychiatrist, a professor, a librarian. And those different people find different entry points into these books. And as a result, they see themselves in this book and they see themselves in the work.
So they see like themselves represented in these like graphic novels, right?
They do, because the reality is that living here in the United States, you know, by 2045, people of color are going to be the majority in this country. Right now, Latinas are actually the largest group of people of color
Yeah.
in the country. We're like double African Americans in the United States, right?
Mhm.
And that's like around 19%. And according to the Annenberg Foundation's recent study, we contribute to easily 30, if not more, percent of the box office share of most movies, but we're like less than 0.5% of the representation on screen. And I'm not talking about being like a co-star or somebody who walks in the background. I'm literally saying like the protagonist, the star of the movie is Latin. Like you look at the Netflix series Wednesday, that is the exception to the rule. where the lead protagonist is actually a Mexican Puerto Rican actress named Jenna Ortega. That's literally like one little granito de arena in a large like desert. So we're significantly underrepresented. So these books that I publish speak to that. It creates a world that's actually not completely fantastical. It's creating a world that's based in Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico, like many other places, particularly if you look at the metropolitan area in Puerto Rico, San Juan, it's racially and culturally diverse. So you can have a story that takes place in Puerto Rico, and you can have her interact with Dominicans, Cubanos, and people of all over the world, and or other Puerto Ricans that look Black, that look Asian, that look mestizo, that look Taino, that look European, and you can have these stories, and that's what I'm trying to show. And unfortunately, there is this perception in mainstream media that our narratives don't have value. And it really comes from us, because if we don't place value in our own stories, how can we expect others to place value in them? Now, the common question is asked of me frequently is, when will the movie come out? And that's an acceptable question, because we live in an era where superheroes are everywhere.
Yeah.
There's a movie.
Yep.
Cada semana sale otra película, or a new TV show is going to drop. And that's understandable. But if you deconstruct that question, we're conditioned to think that stories have to be produced in a big budget, big studio way, and that a story can't be produced in a traditional physical book that we're holding in our hands. And the reality is that for us to see significant transformative change in storytelling, we have to support stories at their source. At this point, studios like Disney and Warner Brothers don't really need their comic books to supersede the sales of their tickets for films. But when you have an independent storyteller like us, our work is literally as successful as the people that buy the books, as the people that read the books, as the people that use the books in classrooms. And we're in this space that is dominating popular culture. And, sometimes I feel like we're like a rowboat amongst like, luxury cruise ships. Maybe not even a rowboat, maybe like an inflatable boat. And I'm afraid that it's going to like pop a leak or something like that. And we're trying to push through this with our stories, with our heroes, but also with our mission. And our mission that is dedicated to crafting stories that are going to challenge our representation, that are going to challenge readers to really look at themselves and look at society in a different way. And also engage them in our larger philanthropic work, because our books, unlike any other comic book that's published, and yo puedo decirle eso puro, que no hay ningún otro libro that can literally say is published for philanthropic work in Puerto Rico. We're literally the only one that's doing it. And we've been like that from jump. It's never been an afterthought. It's always been part of our work and our commitment.
I like the comic book because it gives me like a sense of like nostalgic. Like, I remember I was reading the book, the comic book, and I was like, oh my God, this like reminds me like when I was a kid, but like I can read it now and still have that same like joy, because I was like reading it and I was like, oh my God, wait, like I was reading it into it and I was like, oh wait, then like my eyes shift and it turns to like all the like the bubbles and like all the, I just think that I like the comic book because, not that like I'm hating on like, oh, we don't need a movie, but like I just like it because it gives you like a sense of nostalgic, like when you're a kid, but like it has that issue in the real world. You know what I'm saying?
I know what you're saying, because I think that's one of the reasons why I love reading, whether it's comic books or not. I'll be real, I only read comics. Let me stop fronting. But it's just kind of like you have that intimate moment, right? It's different from like watching TV or watching a video on your phone. You feel like you have a sense of intimacy, but you don't. There's something magical about literally opening up a physical book and reading it, whether you're on your bed or on a sofa or in a corner of a room or even like if you're on a bus going someplace. It's an opportunity to connect. And there's also something important about the whole genre of comic book storytelling, is that it's episodic storytelling. So for someone like me who grew up reading comic books, I've been reading comic books and these characters are still telling us stories. So they become like friends, they become like family, because their stories are continuing. Unlike oftentimes like a novel, for example. Let's look at Lord of the Rings. The books were published and that was it. There were no more extended stories, even though there's an Amazon television series that's revisiting the prequel. and which is amazing, by the way. Shout out to Ismael Cruz Cordova, who's an Afro-Puerto Rican in that show, and a friend of mine. Episodic storytelling is important, and it is, and I think what it speaks to in terms of what you said, nostalgia, it speaks to that kind of like familiarity. You feel something that's familiar in it, and I think also what it does to you as a young woman is that I'm sure it gives you something like she's a hero, and all the main characters in the book are women.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. Dale, sigue.
Well, I personally like the comic just because I can somehow relate to it. It's also because it starts off with her as just a normal teen or as a normal like student in college, and then all of a sudden she gets these powers from where her parents are from and her culture, and so she starts to, fall in love more with her culture and start falling in love with the idea that she's helping her country into becoming something better for the people living there.
I think it speaks to something that speaks to the immigrant idea, the immigrant, even as Puerto Ricanos, we're migrants because we're U.S. citizens. And even you, when you opened a conversation, when we were warming up, you were speaking proudly and lovingly of Spain, right? Mm-hmm. And it's something that when you have that first or second generation connection still too, like many people here in the United States, they're so far removed from their point of origin, right? That they create this kind of like American identity, which is oftentimes devoid of any history that predates 1776, right? And I think one of the things that, and speaking specifically as someone who's Latino, right? Our connection to our heritage is something that we hold with pride. We wear our flags literally on the rearview mirrors of our cars. Some of us get tattoos. Whenever there's a cultural festival, you'll see Nicaraguans or Panamanians or Colombians coming out and pride. You know what I mean? There's something also because of our like shared language that we all speak Spanish, that we kind of had this opportunity to kind of like connect. That everyone loves Bad Bunny because he speaks, even though his slang is very, very Puerto Rican. But it's something important to understand that when we have this connection to our heritage, like this character does, that's actually a place of empowerment, right? Because we live in a country oftentimes where we're told to speak English, speak the language, go back to your own country. How do I pronounce your name, right? My birth name was actually Edgar. Right? Edgar Miranda. And when I was in elementary school, everyone was calling me Edgar Miranda. And by the time I was in high school going to college, I was like, enough of this. I'm Edgardo Miranda-Rodriguez. That's my name. Deal with it. There's no nickname. There's no anglicization of my name. This is my name because this is my family and this is my identity. And I'm not going to change it to make you more comfortable. Right. If anything, you have to learn and understand it. And like, oftentimes people will struggle with the name of the book, La Borinqueña. And I'm like, mira, if you can learn how to speak in Klingon or how to speak Elfish or how to speak in any other fantastical language, you can learn how to say a Taino word. You can learn how to say words that have an enye, that have some Spanish kind of like connotation to the root of the language. And I think all of this is important for this conversation that we're having.
Okay, so you answered the next couple of questions we were going to ask you, but that's okay because you still answered them. But in class, we watched an interview that you had done where you had stated that you were very intentional when you created her. Can you explain to our listeners what you mean by this?
So when I came into the space of creating La Borinqueña, I was already a professional graphic designer. I was already a professional creative director, a father, a husband, an activist. So this was not some arbitrary idea that just came to me. I was inspired by this economic crisis, which is still affecting Puerto Rico, which led to a humanitarian crisis, an $80 billion debt that led to the closure of close to 500 public schools that led to a massive exodus of white-collar workers, literal professionals, scientists and chemists when the pharmaceutical industry in Puerto Rico collapsed. And I thought to myself, I want to create a project that will engage people in a conversation. And mira, look, 7 years later, it works. We're still having this conversation. I want to, but using something that's very familiar to people, and also using something in a way that hasn't been used before. Superheroes are characters that are literal narratives centered around social justice. But the problem is that this narrative has been appropriated by corporations and they're selling it back to us. There's an interesting interview that Ryan Coogler, director of Black Panther, said once that he was very surprised that Disney let him keep a line of dialogue that Killmonger had with T'Challa when he said, "Bury me in the ocean with my ancestors." And that was shocking that he would be allowed to have that. And I think to myself, why wouldn't they? They are the power structure. Do we have the power to overturn the power structures in this country? Do we have the power to overturn and make bigger studios than those that exist? No, but we have the power to tell enough of our stories that we can share it amongst each other. Maybe my stories won't reach millions of people, but if it reaches thousands, well, then it's reached thousands. And if those thousands of people that are listening to this, that are in this room, will make something of a significant change in their lives, then caramba, that's the impact that I want to make, because that's the root of activism, right? And in terms of the character, how she was intentionally designed, I said, these narratives of superhero storytelling have been dominated and continue to be dominated by white male characters, and also told from the white male perspective. And that's not going to change. You can recast certain characters as Asian, as Latin, as the African American, like Namor, who's brilliantly portrayed by Tenoch Huerta, but that's not going to change the reality that the majority of these characters have and always will be white. So I intentionally said, this character, she's going to be Afro-Latina. She's gonna lead this narrative as a woman. My sons even told me when we were developing the Nitainos, her team of heroes, they were like, you know what? Everyone on the team should mostly be women, because almost every superhero that's out there is almost all men with like one woman on the team. I think it should be completely flipped the other way around. And talk about transformative change. My sons are telling me that in the years that we've been publishing this book, they're seeing the value and the importance of changing the narrative. Now, will my books like completely change the entire industry? No, I don't expect it to, but I know that my books have a reach, and that's the idea of this intentional work. I know that I can reach a few thousand people, and to me, that's good, because I don't need to have like como se dice, 43 million followers on social media. If I have enough people that I can engage, then that to me is transformative work, because it just takes one step to move towards progress versus taking 2 steps backwards.
How would you say her costume is so important?
Her costume is important because it's connected to history. There are 2 flags that inspired the creation of this costume. And both flags were actually created by women whose names have been unfortunately erased or omitted from history books. The first flag was the lattice flag, created by a leader of a revolutionary movement named Miranda-Rodriguez in 1868, the first uprising. No diss to Spain, but the first uprising against the Spanish Empire in 1868. And that flag was created and still is the flag of the town of Lares. I believe there was a student here today who said that her family is from Lares. And the second flag is the flag that we all know with the blue triangle, but it's the original flag, because there were actually 3 different versions of that very same flag. The original flag was created by Mimi Besosa, here in, well, not here because we're in Jersey, but in New York City. She was in Brooklyn, and that flag was actually introduced in 1895 in New York City. So it's originally the first New Yorican. Right. And that flag, when it was introduced, was banned in Puerto Rico because it was seen as a symbol of insurrection, of independence. And the administration at the time in Puerto Rico was working with the United States to try to understand what its new status would be. But at the time, there were Puerto Ricanos with U.S. citizenship. And as U.S. citizens, they have unalienable rights granted by the Constitution. So the United States had to remind the governor of Puerto Rico that this law that he enacted that outlawed this flag, that made it illegal to own this flag, display this flag, talk about independence, gather to sing the original lyrics of La Borinqueña was unconstitutional because as U.S. citizens, they had the right to assembly. They had the freedom of speech. And he had to overturn that law that he created. And in overturning that law, he reintroduces the flag with a navy blue triangle. And all of that history from 1868 through 1952 was completely omitted. And when you ask people about the origin of the flag, they say, oh, that was created by Luis Muñoz Marin in 1952, 1951. And the flags were important in designing her costume because it was important that those flags and that history was revealed again, was shared again, was taught again.
Who are the villains in La Borinqueña for people who have not read the comic book? And how are they like representative of real life injustices?
So the first issue of La Borinqueña didn't actually have a supervillain. So when we talk about intentional design and writing, that was intentional. I didn't want a supervillain in the book because superheroes are always defined by the relationships they have with a supervillain. And oftentimes women in storytelling are defined by the relationships they have. And people always expect that a woman character has to be in a relationship. And I realized that women are never given the freedom to just be.
Yeah, I've noticed that. Like
right.
Every thing I've noticed is like, oh, like who's her next like love interest or who's like the man she's gonna meet to help her or something like that. And I really like this comic because it shows that like she doesn't need a man to
she's
like,
independent.
Yeah, she's independent. And like that's why I feel like the comic book is so like inspiring to a lot of us. So, yeah.
And that's important that you point that out because oftentimes it's only men that have that role. Men get to explore. Men get to have adventures. Men get to leave their families behind. A woman is expected to stay home and raise a family. When we first published the book, everybody was like, mira, ¿quién va a ser el novio? Who's going to be her love interest? And I'm like, seriously? So we completely omitted the idea of a supervillain in the first issue. And the first thing that she fights and deals with is a natural disaster because it's related to climate change. It's related to the direction that the world is taking. And that first book was published 9 months before Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico. And then the second book talks about political and economic and corporate corruption in Puerto Rico. And that book predates the massive marches in Puerto Rico that denounced and demanded the resignation of a governor of Puerto Rico who was connected to a lot of corporate and not federal, but local government corruption. So a lot of the stuff that we addressed were not actually embodied in an actual physical supervillain, but it was more like institutional racism, institutional corruption, climate change. And by the third book, we finally introduce an archetypal villain character, but you have to read the story to understand how even that narrative is flipped. Because when I write stories and when I enjoy stories, I personally enjoy characters that are gray. And let me explain what gray means. So you have two extremes from white to black. And we're not talking about race here. We're literally talking about the color white and the color black, right? And it's like one person's going to be like purely like good and one person's going to be purely evil. But I love the concept of that there are gray people because we're all gray. Yeah. None of us are extremely one direction or the other. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you hear someone and you think, man, I don't agree with everything they're saying, but they just said something that makes me go, I actually like what he just said, you know? Mm-hmm. And so when I wrote this character that she faces off, he's saying things that he's physically looking like the villain. He's attacking her. But then when you hear him talking, you're going, caramba, you know, I kind of agree with what this guy is actually saying. It's kind of messed up what's going on, you know?
Yeah.
So it's even in that space, it's challenging the role of storytelling. And I drew inspiration from a lot of the urban legends. In the 90s, there was a chupacabra. In the early 2000s, there was La Gálgola. So La Gálgola ended up becoming this character that's now actually going to have his own action figure because when we were working with a toy company, they were like, we need a supervillain. Everyone needs a supervillain. I'm like, okay. We'll let you guys use La Gálgola as a supervillain. And it's funny because like when all the toy reviews came out, all these like grown men who review toys on YouTube, it's pretty hilarious, right? They were loving La Gálgola and they'd never even read La Borinqueña. There's one toy reviewer, He was like, I'm excited about the fact that I learned how to say the gargoyle in Spanish because of this toy.
So, how do you use La Borinqueña to give back to Puerto Rico?
So a portion of the proceeds of our books goes towards our La Borinqueña Grant Awards. Every year, we raise enough money to return to Puerto Rico to award micro grants. My partner, Kyung Jun Miranda, established our grants program as an opportunity to continually be connected to Puerto Rico and to raise awareness to these organizations that oftentimes are, well, almost like off the grid. Everything kind of works in Puerto Rico as the literal island that it is, or rather the islands that they are. And nothing oftentimes can get to the islands. So we created a program that supports organizations that are committed to environmental justice, that celebrate the promotion and cultivation of Afro-Puerto Rican heritage, that are committed to arts and education, women's health and reproductive rights, and sustainable farming. And so these organizations, to us, reflect true superheroic values. And annually, we return to Puerto Rico to award microgrants. And we're actually going back in April, in just 2 months. And we're organizing it right now. Right now, we have what's referred to as an RFP, which is an acronym for Request for Proposals, asking organizations to provide us with their ideas for how they want to receive our grant. And we will make those awards in April.
Nice. So for our last question, what's one piece of advice you would like to give us?
Everyone has a story inside, and everyone's story deserves an audience. And I think it's time for you all to recognize that that story is within you, and it's your time and your opportunity to share that story. I'll share an example. When I was a child, we had a list every Friday of new vocabulary words that we needed to learn for the following week. I, on my own, decided to write a story with those 10 new vocabulary words every week. That was not the assignment. The assignment was look up these words in the dictionary, write a sentence, and I thought to myself, 10 sentences? That sounds like a story to me. And then I created an episodic story. So every week there was a story that connected to the previous week, And at the end of my story, I would always draw like an illustration that was connected to the story. I wrote a story about 2 raccoons. Yeah. So everyone has a story, and I think everyone has a chance and opportunity to tell that story. And I hope that this conversation sparks something in you to do that. I'll share one more thing quickly. When I was a child in middle school, I had the opportunity of going to my local library to meet the editor-in-chief and illustrator at Marvel Comics, 2 different individuals. But there was a disconnect for me because these were 2 white men. They were not from my neighborhood. They didn't look like me, and they kind of spoke over me. And I thought to myself, I really want to make comics, but is there a space and a place for me? And my hope is that being here in this space as someone who's Puerto Rican, as someone who's a person of color, and those of you who are in this room listening or outside of this room listening, that you see me and say, he looks like my dad. He looks like my tío. I can be like that. I can tell my story because he's telling these stories. And my hope is that there will be many more heroes. Somebody asked me today during the assembly, will there be more superheroes? My question back to you is, will you write that? Will you be the one to tell us and those stories? So thank you for inviting me today.
Of course. Okay. Mr. Miranda-Rodriguez, we just want to say thank you again for dining with us here at Social with a Side of Justice. We hope you enjoyed your time, and thank you very much.
So,
Thank you.
Sir.
Gracias a ustedes. Adelante.